In the course of a riveting on-air confrontation, Samuel L. Jackson pointedly confronted President Ibrahim Traore with an inquiry that left the viewership in collective shock. However, it was Traore's composed and deeply insightful answer that rendered Samuel speechless and indelibly altered his outlook. This remarkable exchange is now serving as a source of motivation for people globally. The studio lights shone intensely, the cameras were active, and a palpable tension filled the room. Samuel L. Jackson leaned forward in his seat, his signature intense gaze locked on the individual seated opposite him, Ibrahim Traore, the transitional president of Burkina Faso. Countless viewers across the globe were tuned in live as Samuel moved nearer to the microphone and launched the provocative inquiry that caused a collective intake of breath throughout the room. Mr. President, do you possess any genuine comprehension of what it takes to lead, or is this merely an act for you? For a brief moment, a profound silence fell over the studio. A couple of crew members traded looks of disbelief. Traore remained utterly impassive. He didn't so much as blink. On the contrary, he met Samuel's gaze directly, poised and tranquil, and said absolutely nothing. Samuel's brow furrowed as he had clearly anticipated an aggressive, defensive reaction. But the only action Traore took was to fold his hands on the desk, his quietude more thunderous than any vocal retort could have been. The very air felt dense as all present awaited his words. And then, his response, delivered with soft yet unyielding force, was "Do you?" Ripples of shock moved through the assembled crowd. Even Samuel's jaw dropped slightly. In that single moment, the entire dynamic in the space shifted, and millions watching drew nearer to their televisions, their breathing suspended. For a stretch, Samuel could only stare at him. This was not the comeback he had braced for, but Traore's. The voice may have been gentle, but the question it carried pierced deeply. "Do you?" Samuel's usual self-assurance crumbled. He parted his lips to retort, but no sound emerged. At last he forced out a laughing, awkward, strained sound and muttered, "Hey, I'm not at the helm of an entire nation." A barely perceptible smile touched Traore's lips. "But you steer destinies, do you not?" Traore posed, his tone remaining gentle. "Every word you utter molds public perception. Each film, each public appearance, you are a guide for them. Have an effect on how they behave toward each other. That is also a form of leadership." He then paused. "So, do you comprehend its meaning?" Samuel was frozen. The audience sat in absolute quiet, observing him as he grappled with the weight of the inquiry. Off-camera, producers conversed in hushed tones. One of them even dabbed at the corner of her eye, without fully understanding why. It was because, in some way, Traore's words were not directed solely at Samuel. They were for every single person watching, and in that quiet space, a sentiment began to awaken in Samuel's heart, one he hadn't experienced in many years. Samuel L. Jackson leaned back into his chair, palpably unsettled. For the first time in a live broadcast, he was without a retort. His thoughts drifted to a long-suppressed recollection. He pictured the face of his grandmother, a face lined with exhaustion but filled with kindness. He recalled her having him sit with her when he was a boy and telling him, "Samuel, real power lies in understanding the gravity of your words." That memory hadn't crossed his mind in ages, not since he had transformed into Samuel L. Jackson, the movie star, the public figure, the tough persona everyone anticipated. Yet here, before him, was this young African president articulating the very same truths his grandmother had endeavored to impart. Samuel felt a knot tighten in his throat. He looked across the table at Traore, who simply remained there with patience, his gaze unwavering and compassionate. Something within Samuel fractured. For the first time in a very long while, he didn't feel like a performer fulfilling a role. He experienced a profound sense of his own humanity. And as the cameras continued to broadcast, he inclined his head downward. The great Samuel L. Jackson was rendered speechless, and viewers across the planet were utterly captivated. As Samuel worked to recover his poise, the silence in the studio became protracted. Then, from out of nowhere, a single person in the audience began to clap. A second person joined, and then a third. In a short time, the entire studio broke into a wave of applause, shattering the charged stillness that had permeated the air since Traore's serene question. Samuel glanced around, astounded. He had arrived with the intent to antagonize, to make a statement, but instead he was overcome by a sense of his own diminishment. Across from him, Trory offered a simple, courteous nod, as if the applause had gone unnoticed by him. His gaze stayed fixed on Samuel, warm yet resolute, a silent invitation to either respond or introspect. Samuel attempted to muster a laugh, but it stuck in his throat. He swallowed with difficulty, hearing the echo of his grandmother's wisdom in his mind once more. When a man causes you to question your own self, my son, pay attention. That is the soil from which personal evolution springs. For the first time in his extensive career, Samuel felt exposed. The cameras were still on. The entire world was his audience, and still, all he was capable of doing was gazing into the eyes of the young leader before him, feeling a peculiar new kind of respect take form within him. The applause subsided, and then Samuel, his voice now more subdued, leaned forward again. "Very well, then," he said, with a trace of hesitation. "What is the meaning of leadership to you, Mr. President, given that you seem to grasp it so thoroughly?" The words lacked their earlier confrontational edge. They conveyed something else entirely. Trory's lips formed a faint smile, but his eyes grew heavy with a profound gravity. "Leadership," he began, "is not a mantle of power. It is not about one's position or grand orations, or even about prevailing in debates on television." He paused, his gaze dropping for a moment as if burdened by the very words he spoke. "Leadership is when your people are hungry and you find you cannot eat. It is when they are frightened and you find you cannot sleep. It is when you carry not only your own suffering, but theirs as well." He raised his eyes back to Samuel, and the audience could perceive the shimmer of moisture in them. "That is what leadership is," he concluded, his voice faltering slightly. "And each day I question if I possess the fortitude to continue to bear it." The studio was once more enveloped in silence. Samuel could not respond. His own heart felt leaden, and a burning sensation was in his throat. For the very first time in a long time, he understood. The ensuing quiet was absolute. It's not a single cough, not a rustle of movement, not even a faint murmur could be heard. The audience remained motionless, many struggling to hold back tears. Samuel averted his face slightly, his jaw clenched. The cameras captured the gleam in his eyes regardless. A wave of shame washed over him. He was ashamed that he had come with the intent to disgrace this man, to dismantle him for public entertainment. And yet, here Trory was, exhibiting a level of grace and humanity he himself hadn't displayed in decades. Trory did not revel in his victory. He didn't offer a triumphant smile. He just waited, allowing Samuel to be alone with his own reflections. One of the producers gestured for the next segment to start, but no one had the courage to interrupt. Not at this moment. At last, Samuel lifted his gaze. His voice was gentle. "I was not aware you carried all of that," he stated. Trory offered a slight shrug, his expression still placid. "That is because the majority of people never inquire." And with that, Samuel felt something inside of him shatter, for he had come to the realization that the strongest man in that room was not him. It had never been him, and for the first time in his life, he was prepared to truly hear. Samuel sat more upright, fumbling for some way to recover his balance. He couldn't just remain there, mute, before an audience of millions. So he leaned forward, his voice composed, though his eyes revealed his inner turmoil. "All right, Mr. President," Samuel articulated slowly, "explain this to me. If your people mean so much to you, why does such a large number of them continue to live in hardship? Why have you not resolved it by now?" The inquiry was sharp, hanging palpably in the atmosphere. The audience gasped. Even the producers off-camera shared anxious looks. Trory did not flinch. Instead, he nodded his head, as if Samuel had just posed the most significant question of the entire evening. "You are correct," Trory stated with composure. "They do continue to suffer, and it shatters my heart on a daily basis. But mending a fractured country is not akin to repairing a piece of furniture. It requires time, sacrifice, and occasionally an increase in pain before the process of healing can truly start." His voice grew softer. "I may not live to see the harvest, but my role is to sow seeds today, for I hold the conviction that our descendants have a right to the fruit of a healthier tree." Samuel froze, and for the first time, his hardened exterior began to show cracks. The camera focused tightly on Samuel's face. His lips moved slightly, but he remained silent. Trory settled back in his chair, his gaze now far away, as if he were addressing someone not present in the room. "I am the son of a farmer," he started in a low voice. "He toiled relentlessly each day under the hot sun. Yet, we still went to sleep with empty stomachs some nights. One evening, I asked him why he persisted in his labor if our circumstances never improved. The studio was completely still. Trory's voice wavered for a fraction of a second. He said to me, 'Because one day, things will be different for you, for your own children, and for their children after them. That is what it is to be a man.'" He paused, swallowing with effort, before turning his gaze back to Samuel. "And upon his death, he bequeathed to me nothing but that one lesson. That is the reason I do not surrender. That is the reason I withstand their animosity and their falsehoods. Because I am aware that someone must wade through the mire to create a firm path for others to tread." A solitary tear escaped and traced a path down Samuel's cheek before he could check it. He wiped it away hastily, but the act was seen by everyone watching. The world was starting to see, as well. A palpable change occurred in the studio after that. Individuals in the audience bowed their heads. Some fumbled for tissues. Even the most cynical critics on the panel were now silent, either unable or disinclined to shatter the profound atmosphere Trory had woven. Samuel cleared his throat, but his subsequent words were gentler, almost reverential. "I did not anticipate hearing that tonight," he confessed. "I did not anticipate experiencing this either." Trory gave a kind nod, expressing no smugness, no condemnation, only a silent empathy. "None of us ever do," he said softly. "Not until we are reminded that a living heart beats behind every number." The statement landed with immense weight. Samuel pressed his hands together, his eyes fixed on the floor, overwhelmed by feelings he could not articulate. Viewers at home were already overwhelming social media. Excerpts of Trory's speech were spreading with incredible speed. People were calling it the moment that restored their belief. Within the studio, however, nobody dared to shift. No one wished to disrupt the delicate, poignant silence that had enveloped them. And in that quietude, Samuel finally raised his head and managed a faint smile. A transformation had started within him. The studio lighting softened during the commercial break, but the atmosphere remained charged. When the broadcast resumed, Samuel leaned forward, his voice quiet yet resolute. "You mentioned you withstand animosity and falsehoods. But what of your own tranquility, your own family? Are you not entitled to a life as well?" The question was weighty. It was more than a simple inquiry. It was almost a supplication. Trory let out a slow breath. A profound emotion, something no camera could fully capture, shimmered in his eyes. "I have already lived my life," he answered gently. "I have experienced love. I have experienced want. I have experienced joy beneath the night sky. But when you witness your people pleading for aid and you choose to remain silent, you forfeit something no family can ever restore. You forfeit your own soul." A hush once again descended upon the room. Samuel's knuckles whitened as he gripped his chair. Viewers across the globe experienced it as well, the unadulterated gravity of his words. On social media, a new name for him began to circulate: the man who speaks to your soul. And in that instant, Samuel understood that Trory wasn't just responding to him. He was speaking to every person who had ever hesitated to take a stand. The subsequent question was posed slowly, barely rising above a whisper. "What is the most difficult aspect of being you?" Samuel at last inquired. Trory took a moment. He did not smile this time. His jaw muscles tensed, and he averted his gaze for the first time during the interview. "The most difficult aspect," he started, "is the knowledge that the very people you are striving to save may never grant you forgiveness for the methods you employ." He turned his gaze back to Samuel, his voice cracking with emotion. "They label you a dictator, an insurgent, a failure. But you persist because you are certain that one day they will perceive you not as an obstacle in their path, but as the man who prostrated himself so that they might advance." And then an astonishing thing occurred. Samuel brushed his cheek and found it was damp. He attempted to dismiss it with a laugh, but the cameras captured the evidence. A tear, the actor celebrated for his unyielding persona, his fiery disposition, sat there, moved beyond expression. The audience was motionless. Viewers in their homes were weeping without reserve. Even the camera operators were blinking back tears. In that studio, everyone present felt what Samuel was feeling, a profound sense of humility mingled with a newfound hope. For the first time, Samuel leaned back, his posture relaxed. It was as if all the combativeness within him had simply vanished. He regarded Trory with a changed expression now, not one of defiance nor of skepticism, but of quiet reverence. "I believed my purpose here was to challenge you," Samuel conceded, his voice breaking. "But instead, you have revealed more to me about myself than I could have ever imagined." Trory offered a faint smile. "That is something we all require from time to time," he said softly. "Someone to remind us of who we truly are." The audience responded not with applause, but with silence, that uncommon, sacred silence that communicates more than any ovation ever could. Social media platforms were inundated with video clips of that specific phrase, "someone to remind us who we really are." And for Samuel, it signified the start of something new. In that moment, he was no longer just an actor or a celebrity. He was a man laid bare before another man who stood taller, not due to his authority, but due to the magnitude of his heart. And all around the world, millions of people began to recognize Ibrahim Trory for who he was, a leader of souls. The cameras continued to roll, as Samuel eventually recomposed himself, but the entire mood of the interview had been irrevocably altered, and every person watching could sense it. Samuel leaned in and asked softly, "Does it not ever become too much to bear, shouldering the burden of an entire country?" Trory's lips drew into a tight line. His gaze wandered for a moment, and then he nodded. "Every single day," he answered. "Quietly, it is a weight that feels like it's crushing your chest. You witness mothers laying their children to rest. You witness men collapsing under the strain of hunger and terror, and you are aware that you cannot rescue all of them." His voice broke just a little, and his eyes glistened. "But I bear it nonetheless," he continued, his posture straightening. "Because if I do not, who will?" For the first time that evening, the audience offered a soft round of applause, hesitant and almost worshipful. Samuel swallowed with difficulty. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed his question cards down. And across the globe, social media ignited once more. People shared his words with a single hashtag #IFIDONT, who will. The sentiment transformed from a simple statement into a global rallying cry. By this point, the interview resembled a session of therapy more than a news segment. Samuel took a deep breath before he spoke again. "You know," he started, his voice hushed, "I came here thinking I would expose you, but now I am the one who feels exposed." Trory inclined his head with curiosity. "I have dedicated my life to portraying tough characters," Samuel went on, "both on the screen and off. I believed I had a grasp on strength, but what you possess, it is something different. It is a form of love masquerading as bravery." Trory's eyes grew gentle. "That is the sole form of bravery with any permanence," he stated with simplicity. Samuel leaned back, and for a considerable time, he was unable to speak. He simply looked at Trory, perceiving him not as a political figure, not as an unknown person, but as a man who had somehow managed to break open his own soul. The camera zoomed in as a tear streamed down Samuel's cheek. "Thank you," he whispered, and millions of viewers at home felt a similar shift occur within themselves. As the final part of the live broadcast neared, the studio lights grew brighter. The host began to conclude the show, but the audience was not prepared for it to end. Individually, people started to get to their feet. It began with an older woman in the first row, then a young man, and soon the entire studio was standing. A standing ovation, not for the cinematic icon, but for the unassuming statesman from Burkina Faso, who had articulated his truth without rage, without vanity. Samuel also rose, clapping with the crowd, his face streaked with tears. Trory, clearly affected, stood and put a hand to his heart. "I am no better than any of you," he addressed the audience, "but I vow to perpetually strive to be deserving of this honor." The cameras swept across the faces in the crowd, people weeping, smiling, clasping hands. And all over the world, Viewers posted an endless stream of comments. He restored my faith in humankind. The world is in need of more men. Like Trory, I cannot stop weeping. Thank you. On that night, hope seemed attainable once more. The studio was already charged with unrefined emotion. Samuel, still discernible affected, but now deeply reverent, gave his notes a final look. He cleared his throat. "There is one final question I must ask you," he said, "and I ask your forgiveness. If it comes across as severe—" Trory nodded calmly. "Ask." Samuel leaned in, his voice low but incisive. "How do you sleep at night knowing you can't save them all?" The words were as sharp as broken glass. A gasp went through the studio. Even Samuel seemed taken aback by his own directness. Trory did not react. Instead, he shut his eyes for a second, then opened them and said, "I sleep with the knowledge that I tried, that I did not avert my gaze from them, that I did not permit fear to render me a coward." He paused and offered a faint smile, "And even if I do not succeed, they will know I stood with them till the end." The silence that came after was so profound it felt holy. Samuel sat back, utterly speechless. For the first time that whole evening, he was unable to find a single word. The live broadcast concluded, but not a single person moved. The audience stayed on their feet, many dabbing at their tears. Samuel extended his hand and shook Trory's, with firmness, clasping it for longer than he had intended. "You have transformed me this evening," Samuel whispered. "I will carry this with me always." Trory returned his gaze with a warm, unwavering look. "That is the greatest aspiration any of us can have," he answered, "to leave another person better than we found them." Behind them, members of the studio crew wept without sound. The cameraman himself was wiping his eyes. The digital world was already alight with conversation. Trending hashtags, millions of shares. People writing about how this one interview had caused them to reevaluate what it means to lead, what it means to have compassion. Outside the studio, crowds had already formed on the street. Some were waving flags of Burkina Faso. Others were simply standing in quiet solidarity. That night, the world seemed a little less heavy, because one man had refused to yield to animosity or hopelessness. 3 days later, the clip had garnered over 300 million views. People from all walks of life, of all ages, were discussing Trory's words, "I stood with them till the end." On his flight back, Samuel made a post on social media. "My intention was to interrogate a leader. I instead encountered a mentor. Thank you, President Trory. You have shown me the true face of valor." The comments section was flooded with accounts from viewers who felt changed, who had wept while watching the exchange, who pledged to advocate for others in their own small capacities. Ibrahim Trory went back to his duties with quiet humility. But the world would never forget his words from that night. In the heart of everyone who watched, a kernel of hope had been sown. And as the credits began to roll, the broadcast concluded, with the lingering image of Trory's serene smile on the screen a testament, that one individual's love for his people can resonate with the entire world. To our audience, if this narrative resonated with you, if it brought a tear to your eye, or a spark of inspiration to your spirit, we invite you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and please share in the comments which moment affected you most profoundly. Your engagement helps ensure that stories such as this continue to be told and heard. Together, let us amplify this vital message of hope.